Hello! So today we're going to talk about water potential and light curves. We're going to start off with light curves. This is mostly to get you prepped and ready for the Qubits lab, especially if we're in person or online. We need to talk about light curves, and then we'll talk about water potential. All right, so like I mentioned, we're going to start with light curves. First, we need to orient ourselves to this graph. Okay, so this is a light response graph, right? And our y-axis here is the amount of carbon dioxide that the plant is taking in, right? Our x-axis down here is the amount of light that we are exposing that plant to, right? The green line on this plant is the photosynthetic rate, right? That's the response of the plant, right? So you can see that as we increase light, right, over here, right, we increase the amount of photosynthesis that happens, right? There's some other terms on here that I want to talk about, right? So let's get into that, right? The first one is Amax. That is the maximum rate of carbon that can be taken up by the plant from the environment, right? So at some point, no matter how high you turn that light dial, right, how much light that plant is getting, there's going to be a maximum amount of carbon dioxide that the plant can take in to use in order to do photosynthesis, right? If that number over here on the carbon uptake is less than 0, then what's happening there is called the light compensation point, right? This is where there's no carbon being taken up, and instead the photosynthetic rate matches the cellular respiration rate. Remember that cellular respiration is when you are using oxygen to make energy, right, and you're releasing carbon dioxide. So there's no that LCP, that 0, is where there's no net uptake of carbon dioxide, right? If it's below 0, then the plant is doing more respiration than photosynthesis, right? So they're essentially not taking in any carbon dioxide, they're producing carbon dioxide, right? So that's the LCP, right, and the Amax. The next one is the light saturation point, or the LSP, right? This is the maximum level of light that the plant can respond to, right? So essentially your photosynthetic rate stops going up, right, at a maximum light, and the plant can't take in any more carbon dioxide, okay? Right, so now let's move on to water potentials, okay? All right, so let's talk about water potential. Water potential is the tendency of water to move, right? Water tends to move from an area of high potential to low potential, right? And that water potential is defined by two things, solute potential and pressure, all right? Solute potential is just the water potential due to the differences in the solute concentrations, right? You've probably heard the terms hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic. Remember that when you use them, you have to compare it to something else, right? So an isotonic, the cell, right, has the same solute concentration as the outside, so iso means same, right? That would be a movement of water that is a net of 0, okay? And hypertonic, right, and hypotonic, right? So osmosis, you know, right, is a movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane, right, from an area of low solute to high solute concentration, right? And that's essentially from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. I like to think of it as water trying to balance out the two sides by diluting the side that has more salts, right? So that's where we're going with water potential, okay? So we ought to think about it in terms of salts, right? Pressure is also important, but when we're talking about plants, we're mostly talking about, right, the concentration of water, right? So cells can change the concentration of themselves, right? And this root hair, you can see, has more salt in it, right? Which means that water would flow into that, okay, via osmosis. Right? So as water moves, let's talk about how that's going to happen. Okay, so in the first step, water is taken up from the soil, right? It then enters the roots via the root hairs, right? It's then moved into the xylem, into the stems, and it's going up the plant, right? It enters the veins of the leaves, right? And then it evaporates through the stomata. And so we're going to talk really quickly now about how that's happening, right? We know that it's water potential, but how is it happening, right? And so that's water potential, right? Note down here, this is the water potential on the x-axis, right? So water in the soil, right, has a much higher potential than the water that's in the atmosphere. And so it's going to move from the soil up through the plant to the atmosphere. And I like to think about it this way. There's not a lot of water in the atmosphere, but there's potentially, right, a lot of water in the soil. So water is going to move from where there's a high potential, lots of water, to an area where there's low potential or not a lot of water. So essentially that's what's happening, right? And we're going to do that through a mechanism that we call the cohesion tension mechanism, right? So water moves from the higher potential, right, down in the soil to lower potential out in the atmosphere. Right? So like I mentioned, they use a cohesion tension mechanism to do this, right? And let's go through it. So the first step of this is the evaporation, right? So the evaporation through the stomata on the leaves, right? And one thing to remember is that water is sticky, not sticky like glue, right? But the water molecules stick together, especially if they're in a water form or an ice form, right? And so when you pull out water from the evaporation, right, because there's lower water potential in the atmosphere, then it's going to pull those other water molecules along with it, right? So evaporation is happening in the leaves, right? And then we get the cohesion, right, the stickiness of water pulling those water molecules up through the stem of the plant, right? And it's because of those hydrogen bonds that we talked about, right, that water molecules are sticky, and if they're in water form, right, those are going to be pulled up, right? And then the last part is the tension, right? Because of that cohesive nature of water, right, that stickiness of water that's going to bind them together, right, it creates tension, and that tension is what pulls the water up into the root hairs, right, and then into the xylem, and then all the way up through the plant, right? So if that didn't make a lot of sense, I'm going to actually include a short video for you to watch in the online homework assignments that's a little bit more about water potential. It's going to be optional, so if you understand all of this, you don't have to look at that. I am not ever going to ask you to do any of the equations of water potential. If you take a plant class later in your career, you'll have an opportunity to dig in a little bit more to water potential. So I'll see you next time. Bye.